It's an honor to speak after Bobina has given her presentation because, may I suggest respectfully, that those of you who are in this room, even if you are not lawyers and even if you had not been students in legal clinics, are standing on the shoulders of great women in your country, like Professor Bobina.
Velika mi je čast da govorim posle profesorke Bobe i ako mi dozvolite, rekla bih da sve vi koji ste u ovoj sobi, iako niste pravnice ili niste pohađale pravni fakultet, ipak svoj rad bazirate i na radu prethodnice kakva je profesorka Slobodanka.
I really want to emphasize that word, standing on the shoulders, because that is what women's history and feminism teaches us. And I believe for each country it is important for activists and lawyers and feminist doctors and feminist social workers to get together and to rewrite the history of their countries.
Želim opet da podvučem to stajanje na ramenima prethodnice, izrasti iz njenog prethodnog rada je jako važno, posebno za nas feministkinje. Važno je da se podsjetimo svih onih koje su pre nas, feminističkih advokatkinja, doktorica, koje su radile pre nas i na čijem radu mi dalje nastavljamo.
Because the history that you and your members of your communities have been taught is not the full history of your country and your society, because half the population is usually excluded from the history books.
Jer istorija koju smo učeni, istorija našeg društva, obično isključuje polovinu populacije, tako da to nije potpuna istorija.
And I think it's important to know one's history because it gives one inspiration and understanding, and for many of us in my country, the discovery of the women in the 19th century who not only fought against slavery for black people, but articulated the idea that women were also enslaved by a patriarchal system is an extremely important and an inspiring experience for us, and for those of my generation and future generations, changed our lives with that knowledge.
Ono što je jako važno, recimo za istoriju u mojoj zemlji, mislim da je jako važno da poznajemo sopstvenu istoriju, zato što to može biti mesto inspiracije. I recimo u mojoj zemlji upoznavanje sa istorijom 19. veka, kada smo učile o ženama koje su se borile ne samo protiv ropstva i koje su se zalagale za crnačko pitanje, već koje su i definisale da su i žene te koje su bile zapravo na neki način u ropstvu. To je bila veoma važna stvar za sve nas u našem procesu razvitka.
Baba and I have had long talks, and Vanya is certainly a woman with whom I've had many conversations. Legal education is terribly, is bad education. It's badly taught, pedagogically it's unsound, and it doesn't teach law students to think critically as lawyers. That's not Bobina's class, but almost around the world, I would say, universally, this is the case.
Razgovarali smo Boba, Vanja i ja i sa mnogim drugim ženama sam pričala o tome da je nastava na pravnom fakultetu jako loša, pedagoški loše postavljena i da ne uči buduće pravnike i pravnice kritičkom razmišljanju.
Now, I want to make the argument that it's no accident that women's rights are not included in legal education.
Moja teza je da nije slučajno da ženska prava i žensko pitanje nije deo kurikuluma na pravnim fakultetima i pravnog obrazovanja.
Because women's rights destabilize patriarchal assumptions, patriarchal knowledge, and patriarchal practice. So there is a large stake in law faculties, in legal institutions, maintaining the institutions of patriarchy by denying the existence of women's rights as legal issues. Instead, what often happens in law faculties and among lawyers is that women's rights become cultural issues. over there, not at the center of an understanding of rights.
Mislim da žensko pitanje i ženska prava zapravo nisu deo tog kurikuluma zato što bi zapravo dovelo u pitanje patrijarhalne pretpostavke, znanja i prakse koje se sprovode na pravnim fakultetima. I pravni fakulteti kao institucije podržavaju patrijarhat i u tom smislu bi bio za njih preveliki ulog i preveliki rizik da zapravo žensko pitanje i ženska prava uvedu u kurikulum, već ga postavljaju kao neko pitanje kulturalnih prava. Znači skreću ga kao pravno pitanje, već ga postavljaju kao kulturalno.
Yes, thank you. And the importance of that should be emphasized because law faculties are state-funded institutions.
Ali važnost toga mora da bude stalno podcrtavana zato što su pravni fakulteti institucije koje su na državnim budžetima.
And I believe that the failure to teach women's human rights is a violation of the CEDAW convention that your country has signed. Unfortunately, my country doesn't think it needs to sign these documents. But most countries in the world have signed that document, and I believe we can make the argument that the failure to teach women's rights in the school systems and in the universities and in the law faculties is a violation of the CEDAW convention.
Mislim da možemo da postavimo tezu da je to izbjegavanje da se o ženskim pravima uči na fakultetu zapravo povreda CEDAW konvencije koju je vaša zemlja potpisala. Moja, nažalost, smatra da nema potrebe da potpiše takvu konvenciju, ali možemo da postavimo to kao tezu. Znači, izbjegavanje da se ženskim pravima uči na pravnom fakultetu je direktna povreda CEDAW konvencije.
Now I would like to turn my attention and ask the question or actually make the observations and ask the question of why it is so important for lawyers and activists to work together.
Sada malo da preokrenem pitanje, zašto je toliko važno za pravnike i pravnice i aktivistkinje da rade zajedno?
I can think back to more than 35 years of activism and being a lawyer and being a law professor.
Imam 35 godina iskustva sa jedne strane pravničkog rada i toga da sam profesorka prava, ali ujedno i aktivističkog iskustva.
Many of you are very young. Let me tell you very, very honestly that I believe that the work of activists and lawyers together, and certainly I know this from my country, and I think we have very good examples from Europe, have literally changed the frame of reference regarding women and women's lives in the law.
Mnogi od vas ste mlade, ali dozvolite da vam iskreno kažem da je zajednička kooperacija, rad pravnika, pravnica i aktivistkinja u potpunosti promenio način na koji se govori o ženskim pravima.
35 years ago, the words gender-based violence, people would scratch their heads and say, what is that?
Pre 35 godina, ako biste spomenuli rodno zasnovano nasilje, ljudi bi se češkali po glavi i pitali šta je to zapravo.
Rape and sexual violence was dominated by notions of stereotypes.
Silovanje, seksualno nasilje, uopšte terminologija o tome je stereotipi su prevladavali tom terminologijom.
When feminist lawyers and feminist activists began to ask questions about what constituted consent in a situation in which a woman was raped, many of us were laughed out of court. Activists were told that they were crazy and they hated men. It was a completely different world 35 years ago.
Pre 35 godina to je bio potpuno drugi svet i kada su feminističke advokatice i aktivistkinje postavile pitanje šta zapravo znači pristanak u situaciji silovanja, nama su se smejali i izbacivali nas iz sudova.
In many ways, you could consider that the Istanbul Convention, which your country has ratified and now is in the process of trying to implement it, in fact is a marvelous achievement. It truly is, because it is 35 years of work on all continents combined into a document which, even if it isn't perfect, is a powerful statement of change in at least the formal notion that crimes against women include crimes against women's bodies as autonomous human beings, not as the property of men.
A danas govorimo o Istanbulskoj konvenciji kao jednom nevjerovatnom postignuću aktivistkinje i advokatica širom sveta, u kome su jasno označeni zločini protiv žena kao zločini protiv autonomnih ljudskih bića, ne objekata.
Sometimes, and certainly in my country as well, during periods of backlash, when misogyny, which we define as a hatred of women, often based on anxiety about women. I think there are very many psychological levels to the backlash, exists in your country and in my country as well.
Mi danas živimo u društvu u kome postoji mnogo mizoginija. Mizoginiju možemo da definišemo kao kompleksan psihološki problem, znači taj ambivalentan odnos prema ženama, mržnja prema ženama zasnovana na tom nekom ambivalentnom odnosu, i mi danas živimo u društvu koje je puno mizoginije.
I purposefully use the word misogyny because I think it's important that we have to understand the way legal institutions, as well as the way legal institutions are influenced by notions of misogyny.
I namjerno koristim termin mizoginija zato što mislim da treba da znamo da su pravne institucije dosta bazirane u svom pristupu prema ženama, baziraju svoj pristup na mizoginiji, na toj ambivalenciji.
Because law very often incorporates and relies on stereotypes that exist in each culture.
Jer pravo često inkorporira stereotipe koji postoje u svakoj kulturi.
And even if the law doesn't say there are good girls and bad girls, in fact, the deep structure of the law makes those distinctions, and the police and the prosecutors and the judges and the parliamentarians often, even if they don't say those things explicitly, they believe them implicitly because that's how culture works.
I iako pravo ne kaže postoje dobre i loše devojke, u praksi policije, tužilaštva, sudova mi možemo vidjeti da je takvo mišljenje duboko ukorenjeno i da oni zapravo suštinski, iako eksplicitno to nije rečeno, implicitno duboko veruju u tu vrstu stereotipa.
And to illustrate that, let me give you a personal example. For 3 years, I learned how to do resocializacija of violent men.
Mogu vam dati svoj lični primjer kada govorimo o resocijalizaciji nasilnih muškaraca.
In my country, men, there are classes of legal offenses short of violent felonies in which men can choose to go, because Americans like choice, not only in shopping but in punishments. You can go to jail or you can go to re-education.
U mojoj državi u kojoj se zalažemo za izbor ne samo u šopingu već i pri kažnjavanju, pri određenim vrstama prekršaja muškarci mogu da biraju da li će ići na odsluženje zatvorske kazne ili na neki program edukacije.
That experience changed my life, doing this re-education.
I to iskustvo je promenilo moj život, učestvovanje u tom programu edukacije.
I learned, because we did it every week for 24 weeks, 25 men for 24 weeks.
Mi smo radili sa 25 muškaraca tokom 24 nedelje, svake nedelje.
And I learned very sadly that trying to re-educate violent men in the middle part of their lives is very, very difficult because there are no rewards in patriarchy for being soft and gentle and kind for men.
I, nažalost, ja sam shvatila da je veoma, veoma teško promeniti muškarce koji su, recimo, na polovini svog života i promeniti njihov stav što se tiče nasilja, posebno zbog toga što u patrijarhatu nema nikakve nagrade za one koji postupaju nežno i s poštovanjem.
And what I learned in that re-education was that even as these men had chosen to try to learn nonviolence, they in fact, at some very deep levels, hated women, needed women, were angry at women, and still wanted to control them.
I ono što sam shvatila tokom ovog procesa, da iako su se ti muškarci prijavili i na neki način želeli da promene svoje ponašanje, nekom dubokom psihološkom nivou oni su istovremeno i mrzeli žene, žene su im bile potrebne i naravno želeli su da ih kontrolišu.
When I say hated, please understand, it doesn't mean that those men didn't think they loved their women. But the way in which love was connected with power and control and abuse, in fact, I heard as being, as hating women in many ways, and then being very anxious that they would lose control.
Kada kažem mrzeli su žene, to nije jednostavan termin, ali način na koji su oni objašnjavali svoju ljubav prema ženama, to je bilo do te mere povezano sa pitanjem moći i zloupotrebe, da je kod njih stvaralo neku vrstu anksioznosti i straha da će i na kraju izgubiti kontrolu nad svojim ženama.
That you as activists know this problem, I hope, and recognize how complex this phenomenon is of dealing with violence against women is so very important.
Vi kao aktivistkinje ste sigurno upoznati i susreli ste se sa tim i razumete kompleksnost bavljenja nasiljem.
Why is this so important? Why is your knowledge so important for those of us who are lawyers?
Zašto je vaše znanje, vaše iskustvo važno za nas, pravnike i pravnice?
For those of us who are feminist lawyers, I believe, or in my experience, we think of law and legal practice as a dialogue.
Verujem da feminističke pravnice i pravnici posmatraju pravo kao dijalog.
It's a form of speaking with those who are oppressed, those who've been discriminated against, and to take their words, their needs, their ideals, their hopes, their dreams, and to translate it into what often seems to be the cold, clinical language of law and legal practice.
To je dijalog sa svima onima koji su diskriminisani, koji preživljavaju opresiju i na neki način pretakanje njihovih reči, snova i nada u taj hladni, ono što se čini hladni pravnički rečnik.
But I truly believe, and I think my colleagues would agree, that we depend on your speaking out so that we can speak out, even if we are talking in slightly different venues or forums. You with your clients, you as NGOs, we trying to deal with prosecutors and judges who often don't have a clue of how deeply misogynistic and stereotypical their responses are.
Nama ste potrebni vi, potrebno je da progovorite, potrebno je da prenesete potrebe onih sa kojima radite, kako bismo mi mogli takođe da vas zastupamo i iako radimo u različitim forumima, na različitim mestima, delimo zajednički cilj, a mi onda moramo to da prenesemo sudijama, tužiocima i svima onima koji nemaju pojma o vašem radu.
And so just as we as lawyers cherish and are inspired by your work and your courage, I hope you too will love your feminist lawyers.
I kao što smo mi inspirisane i jako cenimo vaš rad, nadamo se da ćete i vi biti inspirisane feminističkim advokaticama, pravnicama i pravnicima.
Because what we are both doing as activists and as lawyers is we are speaking truth to power.
Jer ono što i vi i mi radimo je govorimo istinu o moći.
And we both know that silence is death.
I sve znamo da je ćutanje smrt.
So even though you live in a system which is to an outsider confusing, sometimes I think there really isn't even a state. I say from the bottom of my heart, I applaud your courage, and I urge you not to be silent, even in the face of the situations which you find yourself.
I iako živite u društvu koje nekome sa strane može izgledati kao da čak nije ni uređena država, u kojoj iz dubine svoje duše vam aplaudiram i zahvaljujem se na hrabrosti da progovorite u situaciji u kojoj se svakodnevno nalazite.
What we both share, even though lawyers take an oath to uphold the constitution of their countries, is that as feminists we don't ever fully trust the state.
I ono što takođe delimo, iako mi kao pravnici polažemo zakletvu da ćemo se držati ustava naše države, i feminističke advokatice i aktivistkinje, mi nikada potpuno ne verujemo državi.
I have the sense in your country that people generally are more polite. Europeans are more polite than Americans anyway.
U vašoj zemlji imam utisak da ste mnogo ljubazniji, imam utisak da su Evropljani inače mnogo ljubazniji nego Amerikanci.
And so very often here people will say, report things in conversations, and they'll say some perfectly awful thing happened, and then they say, oh, never mind, never mind.
I često čak i u običnom govoru, mislim u razgovoru, ljudi bi pričali o nekoj jako strašnoj stvari i onda bi rekli nema veze.
To someone from my culture, from America, that's astonishing. I mean, you're telling me on the one hand a terrible thing happened, and then you're telling me, well, don't really think about it. Very confusing for me.
Za mene je to jako zbunjujuće, posebno za moju kulturu. S jedne strane mi kažete nešto potpuno strašno, onda kažete nema veze. Jako zbunjujuće.
Certainly in the experience of feminism and the campaign against violence against women in my country, we recognize and acknowledge that we are angry women.
I dozvolite mi da kažem da u feminizmu i kampanjama koje vodimo imamo pravo da kažemo da smo mi ljute žene.
In fact, there's a wonderful group called No More Nice Girls.
Postoji jedna divna grupa koja se zove Nema više finih devojaka.
Because we understand, and I think as lawyers we understand as well, that you can take anger and channel it constructively, and it can be a powerful force for saying, I am entitled as a member of this society and a citizen of this country to the full rights the full human rights that my country has obligated itself to.
Mi smo svesni kao pravnice da je moguće taj bes i tu ljutnju kanalisati u konstruktivnu akciju koja će dovesti do toga da kažemo mi smo ljute jer kao pripadnice ovog društva i građanke ovog društva imamo pravo na sve ono što društvo treba da nam pruži.
So I wish you well, I wish you great success, I wish you moments of joy. I know you will experience sadness and frustration, but I can only say, in the words of the wonderful poet Audre Lorde, who is an African American and a feminist and an activist and a lesbian, Audre Lorde once said, I am not a free woman so long as any other woman is in chains.
Želim vam mnogo sreće, mnogo uspeha, mnogo trenutaka radosti, iako znam da će biti i tuge i frustracija. I želim da završim rečima velike pesnikinje, aktivistkinje, lezbijke Arundi Roy, koja je rekla: ja nisam slobodna žena sve dok je jedna žena u lancima.
Thank you very much.